So there's one question that's asked again and again. It comes up in camps. It comes up when, often we discuss Gurbani with our friends and family, is that is everything predestined or do we have free will? Right? Is everything beyond our control? It's already written the way it's going to happen? Or do we have free will? Do we have, the ability to change things? So this is a question that has to be understood with the light of Gurbani. So if we were to understand, this idea of free will. So what does free will mean? It means that we have the ability to choose what we do, right? And it does appear that we have free will, right? We can choose whether we want to go somewhere or not. We can choose whether we want to do something or not, right? But Gurbani also tells us that whatever we do, we're responsible for the fruits of that action. And whatever we do actually conditions our mind in a certain way. And that theory is called karma or karam in Punjabi. So whatever we do, we bear the fruit of that action, and that action itself has an effect on the mind. And this is also psychologically true, right? So if we do a certain thing again and again, we become predisposed to doing it. And if we get a reward for something, they've studied this in animals, that if a mouse is rewarded for a certain behavior, that behavior it's more likely to do again and again. So yes, we can choose what we do, but whatever we choose will condition our mind and will influence all future decisions. Now, there's also one other thing that we have to understand of hukam. For example, Gurbani says that everything that happened in the past, everything that's happening now, and anything that will happen in the future is according to the will of God. Now, how do we reconcile that with this concept of free will? Now, if we were to divide things into past, present, and future, it might be a little bit easier to understand. For example, the past, there's nothing really we can do about it, right? So it's already happened. And Gurbani says that we should recognize it as such. And recognizing it as such can actually free us from a lot of guilt, from a lot of regret. Because Guruji says that whatever has happened, recognize it as the will of the Lord. And there's nothing that could have been done or that can be done to change it. Guru Arjan Dev Ji says in Sukhmani Sahib, Jo hua hovad so janne, prab apne ka hukam pachane. Whatever has happened in the past, recognize it as the will of the Lord. Right? And so this is often a tendency that we have to constantly think about the past, to think about regrets. Could I have done this differently? Could I have done that differently? But Guruji frees us from this guilt if we meditate on this concept, that recognize this as the hukam of God. Now, how do we understand if everything is the hukam, then can we really act freely right now? So those who are Brahmgyanis, those who have gone beyond the ego, would tell us that God is the ultimate doer. Ultimately, whatever we do, it's God doing it through us. It only appears that we're doing it because of our Haumai, because of our ego. And Guru Nanak Dev Ji actually says in Japji Sahib, Nanak, hukmai je bujhe. If we truly understood God's will, if we truly meditated on it, ta Haumai kahe na koi, then we couldn't speak out of ego, because we would merge into the will of God. We would no longer have to decide what's right and wrong. We would surrender our ego to God, and God's presence would act through us. But as long as we're in the grip of the ego, it does appear that we have free will. But to those who have gone beyond their ego, they've truly realized that everything happens according to the will of God. And this is how we can circle back and also understand, if truly God is doing everything, then why are we responsible for the fruits of our actions? So, we may have learned that in Sikhi, we have to account for our actions. Like the Dharamraj asks for our good and our bad deeds. And also here and now, if we do good deeds, we feel we reap the rewards for those. If we do bad deeds, we suffer in misery, right? So we have to reap those consequences also. But that's as long as we're in the grip of Haumai. As long as we're in the grip of the ego, then we are responsible for the fruits of our actions. And Gurbani also says this. Guruji says, Datta dos na dehu kisai. I do not blame anybody else, dos karama aparneya. Whatever I have done, so I have reaped. It's the consequence of my own actions. Jo main kiya, so main paya. Whatever I have done, I have reaped. Dos na dije avarjana. There's no second person that I can blame. But this applies to somebody who is still within Haumai, who's still within the grip of the ego. And another thing to understand is if we truly have surrendered to God, if we truly understand the concept of Hukam, then we'll never say that, God wills this or God wills that, because we cannot say what God's Hukam is in the future. Guruji says, Hukam na kahiya jai. Nobody can understand the mysteries of God, but we can surrender to God's will. We can surrender our ego to God's will. And in doing that, through Nam Simran, through the teachings of Gurbani, we can move beyond the consequences of our own actions. Gurbani also tells us somebody who meditates on God's name, and in that it is implied going back beyond the ego, is no longer responsible for the consequences of their actions, because their mind is no longer under the influence of Haumai. So to summarize, everything is happening according to God's will, past, present, and future. But as long as we're under the grip of our own ego, we don't understand this truly. We don't realize it, and we have to suffer the consequences of our actions. But when we truly go beyond the ego, then this illusion of free will disappears, and we become merged with God's hukam. We become merged with God's will. So this question can be very difficult to answer, but Guru Sahib gave us all the answers in Gurbani if we try to reflect on it and understand this.